But here are our speakers. Colonel Jody Daigle has served in the U.S. Army for over 22 years, a 2002 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He held numerous infantry and special forces roles with 6 combat deployments to Iraq and the southern Philippines. He holds master's degrees from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, specializing in strategy, leadership, and international relations. Also delighted to welcome back Xander Meese, a visiting professor of national security studies at the Army War College and an associate teaching professor at Northeastern University School of Law. Her research on sovereignty, statecraft, national security, democratic participation, and human rights stands at the intersection of policy and public international law. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Lee Turcotte is an Air Force civil engineer and explosive ordnance disposal officer with 20 years of service. He's deployed 8 times, including 4 tours in Afghanistan, where he served on a provincial reconstruction team and led bomb squads to render safe roadside bombs. The way we're going to proceed today is each of the 3 panelists has some prepared remarks. Then I'll ask a few questions and we'll open it up to the audience. So please take it away.
Great, thanks. And for a show of hands, who's a current student here at Penn? Okay, so the majority. So most of you will capture this right away. For us more seasoned people, we'll have to, imagine you're a student at Penn, right? Everything's going well. You got all your classes straight. Life is good. And then you get this assignment dropped on you. And it's not just any assignment. It's an assignment that is critical to, how your college life develops. And it's so important. So it's such a huge gravity placed on this assignment that you need to get an A. Like it's that important. And that's a challenge we all face. We're probably used to those kinds of things coming out, and we tackle it and we accomplish it. But here's the one thing that's going to send a chill down your spine. At least it would for me. It's a group project. And if you're anything like me, that's where the fear comes in. And when I think about group project, I think, oh my God, the scheduling conflicts, trying to get different ideas together, get everyone on the same page, and come up with something that works for all of us. And hopefully many of you don't see it that way. You think, what's he talking about? Group projects are great. Group projects are where we can come together and bring different ideas and achieve something that we couldn't do individually. But if you're like that, you're probably leaps and bounds ahead of where I was when I graduated from college. And back then, it was 2002. I was getting ready to graduate from West Point. And 2002 was right after the 9/11 attacks on our country. And our focus was on counterterrorism. So that was the assignment that I got. And that was the project I needed to get an A. It was a no-fail project that I had to not only do and focus on, but succeed. Because what was at stake was the safety of America, that we couldn't let a terrorist attack like that ever happen again. And what I found in the 20 years of counterterrorism was global security is the ultimate group project. And I had to learn that along the way and develop. So what I'd like to do now is share a little bit about 2 experiences that I had that helped me understand the essence of a group project. And I have 2 experiences, one in Iraq and one in the Philippines that I'll share with you today. And the group project in Iraq was where I was motivated, aggressive. I attacked the group project and I wanted to do it my way. And I put all my effort and motivation into doing it that way. And then in the Philippines, going in where the situation was where I couldn't do it my way. And instead, I had to look at my other group project teammates and understand what contributions we can all contribute and work together to maximize our potential together. So I'll run through all that and I'll do it in 6 minutes so we can get on to the Q&A. So starting in Iraq in 2003, that's when the United States first went into the country. And I was a young 23-year-old, very focused on being combat ready. And our mission was clear: find terrorists, destroy their networks. And in my mind, it was kind of like what you'd see in an Avengers movie, where you bring together an elite team, you find the bad guy, and you destroy the bad guy, save the world. And that's what I thought I was focusing on with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And if you followed the history of our time in Iraq, it was a very rocky road to do that from 2003 to 2011. But in 2011, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was relatively subdued. The Iraqi government felt secure, and they were ready for the United States to leave, and we did that. And along the way, we had trained the Iraqi military. We trained about 15,000 of their security forces on how we did counterterrorism. So in the group project analogy, we did the work. And we took the work that we did and we gave it to our Iraqi partners and said, hey, take this and you finish the project. And we thought that was good. We thought that was success, or I did. And then 3 years later, ISIS develops. They came out of the Syrian civil war, expanded into Iraq. And in 2015, I found myself being called back into Iraq because the government needed our help protecting the capital city of Baghdad. ISIS had completely taken over the north and west parts of Iraq. So I had to pause for a minute there and ask, like, what did we miss? Like, what part of this group project made it to where it never got finished and it just collapsed? And when I thought back into kind of how we did it, again, it was kind of our solution. I had an idea of how the project should go, and that's what I drove towards. What I realized that we didn't take into account was the cultural aspects of everything going on in Iraq. So we built up an Iraqi security force, 15,000 people, but really didn't pay attention to the fact that the culture and the loyalties to political and religious divides would eventually undermine everything that we built. So we had this group project that we were passionate about, but when we gave it over, our partners really weren't motivated on keeping that going. They had a different idea for the group project. And we found that everything that we had built in the Iraqi military units kind of atrophied over 3 years. And then when ISIS came in, it kind of crumbled. So that's the mentality of the group project in Iraq that didn't work so well. Looking in the Philippines, Philippines also had a terrorism problem around that same time in their south, where terrorist elements would take the insurgency that was going on there and hide out to plan attacks. So the Philippine government asked the US military to come in and help support them. But the one big caveat was the Philippine Constitution wouldn't allow US troops to take part in any direct combat action in the Philippines. So I couldn't go in and do it my way. I really had to go in and understand what the Philippine military was already doing and help enable them to do it better. And it turned from the hard power I was used to trying to figure out, okay, all the soft power mechanisms that the Iraqi military had at disposal, how can they use those capabilities and partners to really work as a team, take everybody's strengths and build upon each other to a collective solution. And that's what we did. And it was frustrating at times. And from a person that was very terrorist focused at the time, we knew that there was a terrorist bomb maker that was living about 2 miles away from us. And had this been Iraq, we would have assembled our team and gone after and captured that individual within 2 days. But in the Philippines, it took about 2 months of training and coordination before the Philippine military went in to capture that bomb-making individual. And it was frustrating. But over time, kind of realized that collaboration built so much success that endured. So in 2017, as ISIS was expanding globally, they also expanded into the Philippines, and they overtook the Philippine city of Marawi. They displaced about 200,000 people. And what happened after that was the Philippine military took the lead. They're the ones that planned a 5-month operation to go in and recapture their city of Marawi, to bring the people back in. They didn't let ISIS gain a foothold in the Philippines, and they're the ones that coordinated all elements of soft power to help rebuild and rehabilitate that city of Marawi. So it was a sustainable success, and we did it by not focusing on how we thought it ought to be done, but we used all of the partners in our group project to identify individual strengths. And I realized the Philippines had a strength that I didn't even realize, because I went back to that scenario with the terrorist bomb maker. And I realized the reason why the Philippines took a couple months in order to do that counterterrorism mission was because they understood the environment better than us. You know, had it been me, I would have acted probably hastily and caused more problems than we solved. But with the Philippines, because they understood the environment, they set the conditions effectively so that when they did do the operation, it didn't cause second and third order effects and consequences. Every one of their partners was on board, and they coordinated those elements of soft power to come in and neutralize whatever friction it created. So I think in the end, that's what I want to bring it back to. There's two ways to approach group projects. And I know Iraq and the Philippines, two very different security scenarios. It's hard to compare the two, but I'm not comparing them in terms of the security environment or the fight they're in. It was really about our approach to working with others. And it's very tempting for us when we have a very important thing to do to want to focus on this is the way that we think we should do it, and we have the power and capability to force the solution to where we think it needs to go. But that doesn't always build lasting solutions. It might be good if you're looking at short-term partnerships, short-term objectives, but in terms like global security, climate change, the big things that we need to achieve together, those are long-term relationships that we need everyone's contribution in. So that second model in the Philippines, where we didn't just focus on what we brought to the table, we focused on what everyone in the group brought to the table and maximize those benefits. That would be the takeaway I'd want to relay to you, that if you think about anything that you're facing in your own life, whether it's personal, academic, or a global challenge that you need to face, and it is in the form of some kind of group project where you need to work together, and still pay attention to the contributions that you want to bring and where you want that organization or effort to go. But also take the time to collaborate, understand where other people are trying to contribute, and see how you can empower them. Because when we ensure that everybody can contribute to the effort, that's how we get sustainable impact. Thank you.
I guess that turns to me now. I'm going to apologize in advance. My voice is not the best. I'm fighting a cold. And I also think I need to say this. My comments today are of my own thoughts. They do not represent the thoughts or policies necessarily of the U.S. Army War College, of other institutions I'm affiliated with, or the U.S. government. These are my own thoughts only. So the topic today, it being soft power mechanisms for national security. As a lawyer, perhaps I am biased, but one of the first things that I think of is the importance of law and legal influence when it comes to soft power. And if we think of national security as having 4 Ds, okay? You've got hard defense, my friends here, left and right. That's what most people think about first when they think about national security. But national security also involves diplomacy, development, and democratic governance. And law touches upon all 4 of these. But I think about how much influence law has had in setting frameworks for discussions, for actions, for activities across all 4. And how historically the United States has been a bastion of rule of law and participation in international legal mechanisms. In our current world order, the UN would be top of that list if we look at post-World War II. But there's other international mechanisms as well. There might be bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties, different kinds of international organizations that we participate in and whatnot. And I have been asked a lot of questions recently about, is international law still important? Is rule of law still important? How does international law fit into what is going on in the world today? And then I think back to definitions of soft power, and we think of soft power as being, rather than carrots and sticks, and particularly contrasted with the sticks, that soft power involves the power of attraction and the power of example and desire for emulation. But not just emulation, setting an example that others may take cues from, but then go their own way. And you gave some examples with that when it comes to the Philippines. This is a positive association with nation's reputation, this idea of long-term relationships. I think that's a really important point that you make, and what that may say over time. And I think now more than ever, when we think about the power of soft power, the power to achieve our political, policy, national security strategic ends, we have to think about all of the tools in our toolbox. And with great respect to my left and right, it's not always coming out of the Pentagon. That we can have great influence and we can also help achieve our longer term strategic goals through power of attraction. And where might this come from? This comes from showing up and participation. I think now more than ever, it is important for the United States to be engaged internationally. And I look at historically where we have engaged. And one of the ways and one of the means of that happens to be on education and scientific participation and collaboration. And looking ahead to what may be strategic in the next 5, 10, 25 years for the United States. The poles, so both the Arctic and the Antarctic, are really important for that. And the Antarctic Treaty, for instance, which governs scientific research in the Antarctic, specifically calls for there not to be military activity in the Arctic, but is born of scientific collaboration and this idea that we can learn from that area. Now, there might be dual use activities there, but the idea was first and foremost when it was founded, this is about research, education, greater achievements on science. And that we participate in that and we continue to participate that is really important. Because when we look at the national security strategy and other national security-related documents and policies, we are engaged, we the United States are engaged in great power competition with China. And China is a pacing concern for us when thinking about policies. And we look at what China has done in the development space, in that education space, in research spaces at the poles. And they are spending a lot of attention on that. And we need to continue to engage in that. And one thing that China has done, and with regard to the Antarctic, for instance, is that they have become a consultative party to the Antarctic Treaty, right? They are showing up at meetings, they are building out bases in the Antarctic. And not now, but in 2048, the Antarctic Treaty at that point there's an opportunity for any of the parties to the treaty to call for reconsideration of some of the terms. For example, reconsideration of whether we develop natural resources there or things like that, because currently there's not supposed to be exploitation or exploration or exploitation of natural resources. As the US looks ahead about our ability to influence through soft power, I think it's really important for us to show up to these meetings of the Antarctic Treaty, show up to other international meetings, collaborations, participate in international organizations and international mechanisms, because that allows us to continue to be part of the conversation. We may not agree. We may have a lot of people disagree with what our positions are in these international entities. But if we don't show up, then people will talk about us instead of talking with us and participating with us. And if we think of soft power as that ability to track and influence, it's very hard to influence if you're not engaged. And I think it is very important for us to remain engaged and be engaged in these entities. And if those out there who question, again, but why international law, do these really have meaning if there's no enforcement mechanisms or this, that, and the other thing? I will leave you with this thought. If we look at what's happened in the last few years internationally, including, for instance, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we see that, yes, a lot of folks said this, pointed to the illegality of this under certain international legal mechanisms. What can we do about it? This, that, or the other thing. But you know what Russia did as it invaded? It framed that invasion within international law terms. It gave a legal justification for what it was doing, framed against the international legal mechanisms that are out there. If those international legal mechanisms didn't matter, if they didn't have force, if folks thought they could just ignore them, then why did Russia take pains to frame a justification for what they did in legal terms? And there are other examples of that as well. So I don't think international law is dead. I think it is very important in continuing to be part of our national security considerations in those 4Ds that I mentioned. And I think it's really important for the United States to continue to be engaged in that international community on these mechanisms. And it is part of, and it dovetails with that hard defense. But it is it is an essential part of that. I'll leave it at that. Questions?
Thank you. So I have a bit of a story, kind of a personal story like Jody's of a sort, but there's a saying that in gambling, the worst outcome is to win the first bet. Winning first convinces you that the odds are in your favor, even as you might be going bankrupt. And that's essentially what happened to me in Afghanistan. I deployed there 4 times over a span of about 10 years. And the first of those 4 deployments was winning bet. It convinced me that we could win that war. The 3 that followed gave me plenty of evidence to the contrary, but I never let go of the idea that we could win. Then we lost to the Taliban, and it nearly broke me. My confidence in the United States, in American or Western values, whatever those were supposed to mean, and even, frankly, my self-confidence all nearly collapsed. And I may have had a more concentrated experience of this than most people, but I don't think I'm really alone in that sort of reaction of disillusionment or even cynicism about American values. Seems fairly widespread. I hear it mainly in certain kinds of questions, whether our foreign policy is just a series of disasters, who are we to impose our values on the world, even something like, are we the oppressor? It feels provocative sometimes to say, but even just to believe that we're the good guys. But that's my argument. We are a force for good. We are the good guys, and we do represent freedom and equality and opportunity. We represent those ideals imperfectly. I have no doubt about that, and I won't argue to you for our perfection. Afghanistan was a debacle. You won't get argument from me there either. But the way that war ended, I have come to understand, is actually a testament to our values and to the goodness and the hope that the world can see in us. I mean, how can I believe that? That's the story I have for you. But it starts necessarily, I think, with just a bit of context on recent Afghan history. And that's really just the before and after of 1979. Before 1979, at least in the mid-20th century, Afghanistan was relatively stable. It was a monarchy. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded. In the 80s were a brutal Soviet occupation. That ended. Taliban eventually rose to power. Much of the 90s, brutal Taliban regime. After 1979, one place in Afghanistan remained unconquered by the Soviets and the Taliban. That place was Panjshir province. It's small, but it's a small and rugged mountain valley. It's kind of in the Himalayan foothills in the northeast part of the country. It's where the Northern Alliance was based from. They were the resistance group that fought the Soviets and the Taliban. And it's worth pointing out that Panjshir is where the first American forces, CIA officers actually, went into Afghanistan after September 11th, 2001. The Northern Alliance welcomed them there. So Panjshir, it's, a mountain fortress in a fairly literal sense, but also this beacon of resistance across those decades. That's where I spent my first year in Afghanistan. That's the bet that I won. And as you mentioned in the beginning, I was there on a provincial reconstruction team. That was a mostly military team. There was about 30 of us. We did have some civilians, Department of State, USAID, a few others with us that year. We built roads, bridges, schools, all kinds of that sort of infrastructure. But more importantly, we worked with the local government to build their capacity. And in Panjshir, it was already pretty strong. They were capable, the corruption was minimal, and the province was safe. We didn't wear body armor. We didn't drive armored vehicles. I carried a gun. There wasn't a moment all year where I felt like I might need to use it. Everywhere we stopped, kids ran to us, boys and girls, and asked us for pens. They didn't want candy and soccer balls. They wanted education. Panjshir was nothing but potential, as I understood it. It was the most powerfully symbolic place that I've ever been. I mean, as you drove up the valley, you could see the high watermark of the Soviet invasion. It was where the blown up and the rusting tanks stopped appearing in the hillsides and on the mountaintops. The place was unconquerable. That was its history, and that was the identity of the Panjsheris as well. I finished that year convinced by the successes that I saw and by the sort of spirit of the place that I absorbed, that that was the future for Afghanistan. The second and third deployments were different. In those, I led bomb squads. They were responding to roadside bombs in Kandahar. Kandahar is the home of the Taliban historically. It's in southern Afghanistan. It is geographically and ideologically the opposite of Panjshir. I mean, all of the good things that I could keep saying about Panjshir, all I can really say about Kandahar is that it was war. I finished those two deployments, I mean, honestly, kind of pessimistic. But that was limited in scope. I was not entirely hopeless. It seemed like the Taliban, they might retake and hold the South as their homeland, but they weren't going to get to Kabul, the capital, and central and north part of the country. They certainly weren't going to get to Panjshir. The fourth deployment in 2017, this was 10 years after my first, it was roughly year 17 of the war as well. I was at the military headquarters in Kabul. I was working on infrastructure programs that, as I look back through the record, you could just see where they had failed, year after year, prior to my arrival. It was, the futility of it really was fairly painfully obvious. But from Kabul, you can see Panjshir on the horizon. It was still there, and it was still unconquered. I trusted that that had to mean something. It didn't. In mid-August 2021, the Afghan government fell to the Taliban. And I mean, you could say that's when the war ended. You could say it was the end of August when the last American troops left. But for me, it ended at the end of September when Panjshir, the one place that had never been conquered, when it too fell to the Taliban. It was the last holdout in the country. When that happened, I have never experienced such a sense of anger or bitterness or frankly foolishness. I don't really know what else to call it except a crisis of faith. I mean, I had done other things in my career, before and through those deployments, but my whole professional and emotional investment was about Afghanistan. And so my whole career just felt like a delusion. It was just the sense of what was any of this for? What did we think we were trying to do? And especially American values. I mean, we lost to the Taliban. If I've had a rock bottom in my life, that was it. It's also where this story starts getting better because this actually is a hopeful arc. What saved me, and what I guess I would say gave me a foothold to start climbing out of that hole, was the fact that my career had shown me more of the world, particularly Europe. And what I saw in those places were reconstructed and thriving countries and cultures and whole continents even, that had emerged from the wake of World War II with our help. Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany consumed the world in violence and destruction in World War II. Tokyo and Berlin are magnificent today. Japan and Germany are two of our closest allies. They are forces for good in the world. What I saw in Europe and the Pacific were free and open societies that looked toward us either for their reconstruction in the aftermath of the war or their eventual freedom even decades or half a century later. And I still see more that want to join us. Like Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for its future as a free country. It's very much fighting for its existence. Ukrainians aren't fleeing east to Russia. Last estimate I heard, 7 million refugees may have moved west through Europe. The direction people move in times of need tells you all you need to know. It told me ultimately what I needed to know about the end of Afghanistan, because the same thing was true there. Afghans weren't riding retreating Soviet tanks back to Moscow in 1989. In my experience with them, to be diplomatic about it, Afghans still aren't fond of Russia. But in 2021, they ran toward us desperately. An Afghan couple handed their baby over a razor wire fence to US Marines in the desperate hope of getting their child to freedom. And Marines are a lethal force. That's what they're known for. Our enemies fear them with good reason. When those Afghan parents saw Marines, they didn't feel fear. They felt hope, with good reason. They entrusted their child to us, and their faith was rewarded. They were reunited, and they all flew west together on an Air Force cargo plane. That all happened at the end of a disastrous 20-year war. I can't explain why it lasted as long as it did, the war. I have very different ideas now than I did before about the limits of American influence and about some of our foreign policy. But I know, based on how the war ended, that our values and our ideals matter to the world, whether we like it or not, and whether we even believe it or not. One problem with being an idealist is that when you come up short, which is inevitable, your enemies will attack you for it. The bigger problem is self-confidence, actually. An ideal doesn't die because somebody calls you a hypocrite. It dies when you let go of it. I nearly let go. But nearly 100,000 Afghans came west with us as their country fell to the Taliban, and more would have come if they could have. Their faith ultimately restored mine. They saw the good in us. They saw that we are the good guys. Don't take my word for it. Take theirs. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for sharing your stories and insights. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience to ask. And first question for you, Xander, over the weekend, many people might have seen a lot of discussion about the potential shuttering of USAID.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what's the role of USAID in the functions of USAID in the context of soft power and in relation to the military.
Okay. So I mentioned before those 4 Ds, and one of them being development. For the United States, USAID has traditionally been our major arm for development, at least from the government. Of course, we also have development includes private sector investment and activities as well. But for the United States, USAID has been the agency through which a lot of the development activities of the government, and by development I mean in this case health, food, activities regarding democratic participation, music, culture, arts, somewhat as well, although some of that's through state. These funds flow through USAID. And one myth I want to dispel right now is that, and this has been shown with polling of the American population, is that when asked what percentage of the US budget is used for foreign assistance and things like development, and a lot of Americans will answer with a number of at least 10%. I'm going to tell you right now that USAID's budget is less than half of 1% of the US spending. Okay, so that I want to dispel that myth. It is not even a rounding error. It's a sneeze, right? It's next to nothing. But that money goes for some extremely important programs. One of the most successful of which would be PEPFAR, which was created under the George W. Bush administration and funds health-related activities on the African continent with a focus of HIV prevention and treatment. It has literally saved millions of lives. Okay? There are other things like the food aid I mentioned, right? That goes through USAID. Humanitarian assistance of this kind. Other governments have their own versions of this. I can think of the UK has DFID, there's Norway. China also, for instance, offers development aid. And different countries handle it differently. For some countries, they have their humanitarian aid and assistance folded in to the equivalent of their State Department. In the United States, President Kennedy established USAID separate from the State Department. Of course, the recent news involves a discussion of folding USAID under the State Department. Secretary Rubio confirmed yesterday, the day before,
Yesterday.
recently, that he is now USAID is under his umbrella with the State Department. But traditionally, they have been separate entities. You asked about the relationship between them. Of course, these entities talk to each other, right? You think of foreign service officers, you probably think of State Department. There are foreign service officers for USAID, okay? They have different timelines of things that they think about on programming. Comparatively, State Department tends to be on a shorter timeline because USAID is thinking about, when it comes to programming on the ground, we're talking 2, 5, 10 years down the line, these longer term relationships with local government entities, local NGOs, things like that. USAID foreign service officers, their postings tend to be 3, 4 years or more as opposed to State Department 1 to 2. But they do talk to each other and are engaged in those communications. And USAID folks are the ones who are out all over the countries that they are in, and often in ways that State Department folks are not for security reasons. So there's a lot of communication historically between them, but the two entities have had separate budgets and engaged in different types of things. Think of that D-development as more aid, D-diplomacy being more state.
No, thanks. And let me follow up with a question for our two uniformed military officers. Between the two of you, reading your bios, it sounds like you've been on 14 different deployments in combat zones plus, essentially abroad. You both told really powerful personal stories. Maybe wondering if each of you could maybe say a little bit about how you think about soft power and the role of the U.S. military in working sort of across the interagency to achieve U.S. goals in these various places.
Yep.
I'd say with the military, we all play a role, and our roles are very different. In the USAID example, I had a wonderful experience working with USAID in the Southern Philippines. And that when we're looking at all elements of support we can give to the people, us in the military, we were very effective on treating the symptoms of conflict. Like wherever there was insecurity, we tried to provide security to the area. But USAID and other elements of soft power were focused on treating the cause. So when they developed projects, it was about how do we get this group of people to do something productive, like to pick up a rake and a hoe and do some farming instead of picking up a rifle to fight. So I think we balance each other out. And the military portion of it, from what I see, is we can go in and we can create a stable peace. We can create an environment that lacks conflict. But when it comes to developing the peace, that's where all the elements of soft power have to come in. We have to work in tangent with each other because, like Xander said, we can't do it alone. And sometimes the elements of soft power can't do it alone when the situation is too dangerous. So that's how we complement each other.
Yeah, I really will just agree with Jody. I mean, I can relate it back to it's different kinds of security. This is not something I understood until well into my career, but I remember she was the USAID rep on the provincial reconstruction team. And I remember when she used the term food insecurity, and I had never heard it before, and it just sounded odd to me. I just understood military security. And, this is in my 20s. I was new at any of it, but it's a different kind of security. And it all relates. The military, tends to show up, my counter IED experience, that was a lot of treating the symptom. That wasn't the underlying issues that development work can get after. And so they're essential relationships. There's a lot of military soft power, but there's also an element or a way in which, the State Department can't go as far as USAID in the field in the way that I think they've traditionally operated. I'm a conventional military officer. I mean, Jody was on the soft side. He might tell a different story, special ops side, but I was very limited in what I could go out and do. Development work can have a forward presence and a kind of strategic access that a lot of the conventional military can't. And it can be what's left, even if we lose basing rights somewhere. That's happened in parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world. And so there is a forward presence and just an American presence that you get out of it as, soft power in the absence of the military that I think remains essential.
No, thanks very much. You all have been very patient. And now David over there has a microphone. And so I'd invite you to raise your hands. Dave will come over. If you wish to make a comment, please make sure to at least frame it in the form of a question. And also certainly invite folks watching online to submit questions as well, and we'll try to work some of those in. We got one of our.
Yeah, I was going to be surprised if there were no hands.
During the Kennedy administration, USAID's projects were an important part of foreign policy, especially since the Cold War was a war of ideology. Particularly for Ms. Garver, what impact do you think USAID's initiatives had in shaping the perception and reputation of the U.S. among our allies in Europe then versus today?
I guess that's for me. Are we taking them one at a time or a bunch?
We'll do one at a time.
Okay. I mean, I think USAID and the programs that it funds have had a great influence on the reputation of the United States. And to your point that you just made, in many places in the world, the only contact that folks have with the US or some kind of formal US entity is through a program that was funded by USAID. And these are programs that, when we think back to that definition, the Joseph Nye definition of soft power, right? And that these are positive experiences that influence and encourage attraction to a country. You know, what more positive influence can you have than receiving food via USAID program, right? Or receiving life-saving medicine or healthcare through a USAID program. These can be really important to fostering and engendering a positive view of the United States.
Hi, thank you guys. I was wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the soft power mechanisms that have been at play in the recent conflict in Israel from the American side of things, and maybe will continue to play as negotiations go forward.
I see everyone staring at me again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who wants to take a totally non-controversial topic?
So here, I'm going to say this, and this is going to continue on, which is about the importance of those international legal mechanisms. You see, for instance, there's a case pending before the International Court of Justice that has been brought by South Africa with regard to that conflict. You see multiple organizations have done reports about the situation there. You see huge discussions about distribution of humanitarian aid, food, medicine, otherwise, how states are engaging in distribution of that aid, when to give that aid, how to give that aid. Those aspects of aid are the same types that, for instance, we might see from USAID or things like that. So it's very important on the soft power side. We think of soft power as not delivering military assistance in the form of guns and bombs. This is food and medical care. Aid is very important. And at the forefront of many of the negotiations was, how do we get aid in? How do we have a humanitarian corridor? Things like that. So soft power was and is part of those discussions and will remain so.
Let me add a quick follow-up to that for our uniform officers. To what extent, you talked a lot about your experience with experiences with the U.S. military and in working directly with, say, the Filipino military, Afghan military, Iraqi military, et cetera. To what extent do you all have you all had in your careers conversations with our allies and partners about best practices in some ways surrounding like how we build security in societies, like how to think about some of those elements?
I mean, my mind goes first to NATO. I mean, in terms of working with allies, I've spent 3 years in Germany. I work with NATO. The soft power, it's hard to say that I've had that many soft power conversations. I mean, I was in like infrastructure kind of capacity building roles for, forward basing military presence. I think just the alliance, it's a political and a military alliance, but it is a form of soft power just as a mechanism of dialogue. And it's it's essential for us, and I think frankly, our European allies tend to understand that better than we do. I mean, the nature of, relying on each other as allies and partners, that this is maybe a different angle on soft power.
Sure.
It's like, we can't do it alone. We're better off working together for our mutual security. Like I've sort of felt that and absorbed that in working with NATO. And I've even seen it glancingly in a brief experience with the UN, just as a mechanism to bring people together and have conversations. I think of it very broadly in those terms, but I guess I'll pitch it over to Jody to see if you have more specifics on talking soft power with allies.
I think there's a wonderful opportunity to learn from our partners when we take it. I think there's a danger, and sometimes in our confidence and some would call arrogance at times, that we understand the environment and we have the solution. And that's what my story helped to point to. But by working with our allies, and not even the countries we're working with, but our partners, international partners that we're working with, have different perspectives, because there's no one size fit all to any situation going on. Like what the focus is in Israel is going to be different than the Philippines or Iraq, Afghanistan. It's the people that have the greatest cultural understanding of what those underlying symptoms are, like what is causing the conflicts. They often have the best answer and solution. So it's really about learning from others to get those perspectives and incorporate that into our collective solution. And I think it's about partners, military partners, but it's also about all these elements of soft power, because when you have very complex problems, everybody tends to look at that problem in their own angle, but problems are so complex that we could be looking at it from very different angles and see the same problem, but identify two different solutions. And the more we understand the whole of the problem we're dealing with from our partners and allies, the more effective we'll be in actually solving it.
If I can add a comment.
No, of course.
Carrying on that. When we think about this relationship between military and other aspects of our national security tools, General Mattis, then Secretary of Defense Mattis, said something along the lines of, if you cut the State Department's budget, I need to buy more ammunition. And I think this is a really important quote to think about, because it does show a connection between these different aspects of our national security apparatus. But it also shows that there can be, again, great influence and success in building relationships through those other Ds in a way that may prevent having an active conflict that requires the hard D.
Hi, thank you for sharing your stories, and also thank you for your service as well. So kind of what you guys had mentioned is the importance of engaging internationally and also kind of participating in international mechanisms, but kind of what we've seen throughout different presidential administrations, particularly the most recent one, is kind of almost a retreat from these international mechanisms and institutions. So I guess the question that I have for all of you is that how can we develop or sustain an enduring soft power strategy amidst evolving administrations and differing opinions, and how to go about that amidst different presidential administrations?
All the easy questions today.
Yeah.
Should I go first again, or do you guys want to go?
Sure.
So what I said before, I talked about China as a pacing threat. China is participating in these international organizations, showing up and sitting at the table. I think it's really important for us to do the same. And while it is true that we look at the last, let's say, 2 decades, there's been kind of changes depending on the administration in level of engagement with international entities. Folks, for instance, Paris Climate Accord, I just put it out there, we're a member, we're not a member, we're a member. I think, though, if we think about the long-term strategy, again, what is the plan, not now or 5 years, but the 15, 20-year plans, we need to be more engaged. And it doesn't mean we have to agree. We can show up and say that we disagree. We can show up and articulate what we think are the deficits, weaknesses, whatnot of the international system, but that there is power in showing up and engaging. And if we do want to influence where these systems, where these mechanisms are going, how they're being used in the future, the way to do that is by participating, so that there is still value in that.
I tend to think of it, I mean, yeah, you mentioned kind of long-term and time horizons. And I agree with you, like it seems more volatile in the past, 5 or 10 or 20 years. But in the longer span of time, I mean, I kind of go back to what I was saying in my comments, like that. I think that soft power and that appeal, or like however, whatever the classic framing of it was, of like a city on a hill or setting an example that people might want to come towards. I think that's been true, as we've been more isolationist, in recent years, or, in prior, decades, or, the first half of the 20th century. I think that appeal has been there even as it's gone up and down. And even as things were happening, domestically in our country, the United States, that, at the time, might have seemed to make us less desirable. Or it's like when we might say we weren't at our best, I think that appeal was still seen by, some or much of the world. And so I broadly just derived some reassurance from that. I mean, it can ebb and flow. It's always a project. It'll, we have a, sort of 4-year, or we have a shorter horizon as a democracy with our form of government. But over the long term, like I do see continuity in what we represent, even if, moment to moment or year to year, it's, you got to squint a little harder to continue to see it.
Yeah. And we're not alone in having transitions of government or whatnot. And I would also say, looking further back, so I know we think of this as a new thing that the US kind of changes its position maybe, or is perceived to do so internationally. But there are treaties, for instance, that the United States did not sign or ratify for many years. And then under the George H.W. Bush administration and the fall of the Berlin Wall and whatnot, that was a time when we had a lot of international engagement and ratified several treaties that we had not participated in normally. So that some may say have looked at that and said, well, isn't that a switch? You weren't participating, now you're participating. So it builds time horizons and sort of questions of time horizon. And I just would emphasize this isn't necessarily a new thing, that the US may engage or not engage with particular international entities.
Question from the online audience. What role do universities play in U.S. soft power for its power of attraction, whether accepting international students, promoting study abroad, or anything similar?
I am so glad you asked this question because I actually looked up some data this morning.
Like, why are you here today?
Right? Like, why are we here today? So first up, yes. Okay. Education and educational institutions, I think, are essential for soft power. And I think they have a tremendous amount of potential, influence, goodwill, positive, negative experiences and whatnot that you can see. I myself was a Fulbrighter. The Fulbright program, for example, would be the largest US program when we think about from a federal level of engaging international students and bringing them to the United States. If you talk to Fulbrighters from around the world, right, about their experience and time here, it's almost universally positive. And the folks that spend time here end up having influence not just about themselves and the perceptions that they had of the United States and their own experiences, but they go on to share those experiences with everyone that they touch in their work. And so if we think about the potential for soft power influence, that is a beautiful example, I think, of throwing the rock in the pond and seeing the ripples, right? Now, engagement and how that may have changed and whatnot. I mean, the US nationwide has, let me see if I get this right. We had in 2023 to 2024, 1.1 million foreign students in higher education in the United States. That's a tremendous number. And that is from nearly every country in the world. And just think about that potential. Now, from a federal funding standpoint, we, like the Fulbright program, for instance, while it funds thousands of folks coming to the US, it does not fund 1.1 million students here. But I will say, looking at that potential soft power that comes through educational participation, the number of foreign students studying in China has gone up exponentially in the last 20 years, with a particular emphasis that China has had through the Belt and Road Initiative of sponsoring students from countries that participate in Belt and Road. So they have, I believe in recent estimates, it's between 400 and 500,000 foreign students are studying in China each year. They fund quite a lot of scholarships that more than we fund for Fulbrights. But as there have become more opportunities for students to study abroad, not just in the United States, that's opportunities for other countries to use education as an exertion of soft power, whether that be China. Turkey is another example. It takes a lot of international students in their universities and other places as well. So, yes.
We are just about at time here, so why don't we take one more question?
So specifically for the experiences from both the officers, we've noticed that back then there was a lot more positive and more space for hope in those interactions with the other countries. But as somebody who's an international, who's coming from the Middle East and from South Asia, I've noticed that there's quite a rise in anti-Western sentiment and these sorts of situations where perhaps democracy is not being sought for the same way that it was before. How does everybody on this panel think that soft power can be used to for American influence to revive this sort of democratic principle being prioritized, especially amongst developing democracies or just generally in the global South?
And real quick, what country are you from? Okay. From my view, I haven't seen the degradation that you're alluding to, because in our partnerships, we see the value, and I mean, there's always been I think there's always been challenges in countries that we're working with to let them see like the value in what we bring to the table. We've just been continuing to show, to demonstrate, here's what we do. But from a military perspective, we never go at that topic alone. It's always in concert with the rest of the soft power initiatives. So I see a lot of hope. I haven't seen things go away from that hope of democracy and what it can bring into the countries, unless you have.
No, so I think of it in terms of, and my experience of it was obviously a different perspective than you bring to it, but I think of it in terms, it's kind of what I was saying at the end, my comments with like the limits of our influence. I wonder, I might be returning this to you as a bit of a question rather than a statement, but the lesson that I've drawn from it and what I wonder about is like how I feel like we overreach, like what we tried in Afghanistan was trying to impose something that was, historically, culturally, in lots of different ways, it probably wasn't going to work. And even if it worked in Afghanistan, like it's part of a wider region, in a wider, culture and set of identities and ethnicities. And so a lighter touch and more of an example. Now, democracy is messy, and you look at the American example right now, and it ebbs and flows. It goes up and down. But more of setting the example, and letting countries and parts of the world see that, hopefully see the appeal in that. I guess I think of it more in terms of the soft power potential of that. That there's ways that we can outreach directly. It's like back to the last question about universities sending students abroad, bringing students here. But from the military side, I'm much more cautious about the unintended consequences that we might have created in the world from trying to do it too much with the military, rather than just setting an example.
And the one thing I'll add, now that I thought about it, that there is that long-term versus short-term aspect to it. And in a lot of ways, democracy is hard, it's messy. And in the short term, there are probably other solutions that are a little bit more attractive to people. And maybe that's where you see that direction going the other way, away from democracy, because it is hard. But I think over the long run, everyone will realize the same thing that we've learned, since 1776, when we've been developing our democracy. Over the long run, our democracy creates so much value. And if you look at, how the world has evolved under, the rules-based order that we're currently in, that was established after World War II, and you think about like the rates of child mortality or the rates of poverty around the world. And I think the poverty was once at 60%, and now it's down to 10%. So democracy brings those great benefits over the long run, but it is a long-term game that we need to continue to work towards. So I think the oscillations we see where people are looking away from the democracy that we bring, I think they'll soon realize the grass isn't greener on the other side, and they'll eventually flow back.
All right. Well, I hope you all join me in thanking our panelists for a tremendous conversation today.